For each fight on this weekend's upcoming card, including for the prelims, I'm going to be comparing stats, reviewing recent fighter history, analyzing the results of my 7 data science prediction models, and giving a combined weighted prediction based on those models. I'll also provide my final prediction combining both quantitative and qualitative information together. Later this week, I'll upload a video covering promising underdogs, best inexpensive favorites, and prop bets for y'all to consider, which I'll highlight some great opportunities for you guys. Hopefully you can use these predictions and data to confirm your picks, avoid mistakes, find value bets, or just informative and entertainment purposes to prepare for the lead up to this weekend's event. Please like and subscribe if you find this content interesting, informative, or helpful. It helps keep me motivated to create these videos for you all. I've also added my Patreon information in the description if you'd like to support the channel through that. There's a $10 a month contribution tier and a $20 a month premium tier, which will give you early access to all of the analysis and results for my videos, as well as additional data analysis and stats. So that includes my prediction model results, fighter history, stat overviews, promising underdogs, best inexpensive favorites, prop bets to consider, and a deep dive into each fighter's record history and an analysis through each of their individual historical fights. So you'll get all sorts of stats and data analysis which will help you with your picks and bets. And for 20 bucks a month, which is around $5 per event, you can get all of that information. You can purchase event analysis separately, but the membership is cheaper and easier. Plus, you're directly helping improve and expand the content of this channel. Running this data and analysis, each of the prediction models, the fight simulations, and updating the site takes hours every day and week, so I'd greatly appreciate your support. And thank you all for the recent support that you have shown. It truly means the world to me that we can share our passion for MMA and continue to build this community together. The last thing that I want to mention is that there is a BetUS promotion in the description below. If you use that link, it's an affiliate link, so if you set up your account, you'll get a promotional offer with that. I'm excited to continue working on this analysis and content for you all. Thank you guys again for all of your support. Let's go ahead and dive right into the predictions. UFC Fight Night, Brandon Royval versus Taira is this Saturday. We're going to cover the entire card from head to toe. Let's go ahead and get started with the first fight. We have Clayton Carpenter versus Rocha. So let's review their stats here. We have Clayton Carpenter, who's 5 feet 6 inches tall. He has a reach of 66 inches and he's 28 years old. Now on the other hand, we have Rocha. He's 5 feet 3 inches tall. Yes, that's correct. He's 5 feet 3 inches tall with a reach of 64 inches. He has a 2-inch reach disadvantage here, a 3-inch height disadvantage here, but he is 4 years younger at 24 years young. Now let's talk about striking. Clayton, he lands 4.5 strikes per minute at a 51% accuracy. Now Lucas, on the other hand, he only lands 1.51 strikes per minute, but at a slightly better accuracy of 53%. But that's a lot of low volume if you think about it. Now as far as grappling goes, Clayton lands 2.47 takedowns on average with a 50% accuracy, while Lucas doesn't really have any grappling stats recorded. Now lastly, when it comes to defense, Clayton absorbs 2.85 strikes per minute with a 60% striking defense, and Lucas, on the other hand, absorbs a little bit more. He absorbs 4.15 strikes per minute with a slightly worse striking defense at 33% and a 66% takedown defense. Now let's take a look at Clayton's recent fight history. Now Clayton's recently coming off of that win against Mr. Ronderos, which was via submission back in February of last year in 2023. Now his total record, 7 wins and 0 losses. Yes, he is undefeated. Let's break down his wins here. Out of his 7 wins, 2 of them were KO/TKO victories, 3 were submissions, and 2 were decision victories, which gives him a 72% finish rate and also gives him some versatility across the board. Now, he does have 4 first-round finishes. Recently, of course, he's been on a tear. He's on that 7-fight win streak. His most recent win, again, February of last year, hasn't really been active since then. Now, on the flip side, we have Rocha, and recently he's coming off that win against Davey Bittencourt, which was via KO/TKO back in October of last year in 2023 as well. Now, his total record, 17 wins and only 1 single loss. Let's break down those wins. Out of those 17 wins, 10 of them were KO/TKOs, 4 of those were submissions, and 3 were decision victories, which gives him a pretty high and respectable 83% finishing rate. Now, his only loss was a KO/TKO loss. He does have 7 first-round finishes. Recently, he's been on an absolute tear. He's on a 6-fight win streak. Most recent win was October 2023. Most recent loss was all the way back in October of 2019. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't run these fighters through my prediction models because of the debut here. However, the odd probabilities are giving Clayton Carpenter a 63% probability of victory, and let me tell you why I generally agree with that. First, starting out with the stats here, Clayton Carpenter has a height advantage of 3 inches in this matchup. He has a reach advantage of 2 inches. He lands 3 more strikes per minute. He absorbs 1.3 less strikes per minute, and he has a 27% higher striking defense. Just zooming out and looking at his record, he's won 7 fights, never been defeated. He's finished 72% of his fights. He has had one UFC fight, and he won in that fight. Recently, of course, he's won all of his fights, and he's on that 7-fight win streak. But let's talk about those reasons, aside from stats alone, some of those qualitative factors and those intangibles that are leaning towards Clayton Carpenter here, and pointing towards his victory. So for starters, I think he has a little bit of a grappling advantage in this matchup, so I think he's going to utilize some of his wrestling skills and his grappling skills in order to control and try to finish Lucas here. Now, keep in mind, he does have experience as a wrestler, and he's been in quite a few competitions, so I think that, he has a huge advantage in that regard. So, piggybacking off of that, you got to keep in mind, takedowns and ground control are going to be a key factor to his game plan. I think he's going to try to take the fight to the ground early, and if you look at Rocha's historic record, I think he's shown a little bit of vulnerability when it comes to takedowns in the past, and I think that that's going to play a little bit into Carpenter's strength in this fight. Now, I will say Rocha is kind of known for his striking power and, his aggressive style overall, but in that he might leave himself a little bit open to some counterattacks or even some takedowns, which I think Carpenter should be able to capitalize on here, especially given his defensive awareness and, his ability to time takedowns. If he uses that and he leverages that and he really leans into that strength, then he should be able to outdo Rocha here. Now, I will also say that I believe that Clayton Carpenter is a little bit better when it comes to pacing a fight and just keeping up with his cardio overall. And I think that if he's able to kind of wear down Rocha, especially if the fight goes in the later rounds, the needle is going to lean towards Clayton Carpenter more and more. So all in all, I don't think Clayton Carpenter is going to get the finish here. I think it's going to be a little bit sloppy overall of a fight. Interesting way to kick off the card. But eventually, I think Clayton Carpenter is going to be able to take majority of the control throughout the 3 rounds and take it to the judges and get a unanimous decision victory. But let me know what you guys think. Some of these early prelims and these debuts are very interesting because we don't have a lot of information to go off of. So I love y'all's opinions and, just taking in what the community is saying. For the next fight, we have Dan Argueta versus Cody Haddon. Let's go and review their stats here. So Dan is 5 feet 7 inches tall, and so is Cody Haddon. They have the same exact height. Now, Dan has a reach of 68 inches, while Cody has a 1-inch reach advantage here at 69 inches. And when it comes to age, Dan is 31 years old, while Cody is 26 years old. Now, when it comes to striking, Dan lands 2.18 strikes per minute with a 45% accuracy. Now, Cody, on the other hand, lands way more. He lands 8.57 strikes per minute at a 60% accuracy. That's a huge discrepancy and a huge advantage as well. Now, let's talk about grappling. Dan, he lands 4.45 takedowns on average with a 48% accuracy. Pretty impressive overall. Now, Cody, on the other hand, he lands a little bit more takedowns on average, but at a much less accuracy. And you got to wonder how much the stats are skewed and how many takedowns he's actually done. But anyways, he has a 25% accuracy with those takedowns. Now, lastly, I'm going to touch base on defense here. Dan absorbs 1.9 strikes per minute with a 51% striking defense and a 57% takedown defense. Now, Cody, on the other hand, he absorbs 2.86 strikes per minute, so he does absorb about 1 more strike per minute compared to his opponent, and he has a 74% striking defense overall. Now let's take a look at Dan's recent fight history. Now recently, Dan is coming off of that loss against Gene Matsumoto, which was via submission back in April of this year, just a few months ago. Now, looking at Dan's total record, he has 9 wins and 2 losses here. And let's break those down. Out of those 9 wins, 2 of them were KO/TKOs, 4 of those were submissions, and 3 were decision victories, which does give him a 67% finish rate. Now, breaking down his losses, 1 of those was a submission and the other was a decision loss. He does have 5 first-round finishes out of his 9 wins, but recently he hasn't done well at all. He's only won 1 out of his last 5 fights, and he is coming off of a loss here. Now, his most recent win was back in January of last year, and his most recent loss was a few months ago, back in April of this year. Now let's take a look at Cody Haddon's recent fight history. Now recently, Cody is coming off that win against Billy Brand via submission, which was just a couple months ago back in August of 2024. Now, his total record, 7 wins and only 1 single loss. And let's break those down. Out of his 7 wins, 5 of them were KO/TKOs and 2 were submissions, which gives him a 100% finish rate so far. Now, out of his 7 wins, he's had 4 first-round finishes, which is absolutely nuts. I don't think he's going to be able to keep that up, obviously, as competition gets more fierce and he steps into the UFC and he faces, tougher guys. But so far, the guy's been on an absolute tear. Now, his 1 single loss was a decision loss. Just want to throw that out there. He is on a 5-fight win streak, so he's doing very well recently. His most recent win, again, was August of 2024, and the last time he lost was actually June of 2021. Now, unfortunately, similar story with this fight. I can't run these guys through the prediction models because of the debut here. However, let's look at the odd probabilities and kind of see what's going on here. So the odds are giving Cody Haddon a 62% probability of victory. Now, generally in that range, I kind of agree, and let me talk about why. So first of all, just looking at the stats, Cody is 5 years younger than his opponent here. He does have a reach advantage of an inch. He lands 6.39 more strikes per minute, which is insane. Not only does he land more, but he has a much higher striking accuracy. He has a 15% higher striking accuracy. He also has a 23% higher striking defense than his opponent here. He lands 0.31 more takedowns on average, and he lands 3.2 more submissions on average as well. Now let's recap Cody's record here. He's had 7 fights, he's finished 100% of them, and although he hasn't had an official fight within the UFC, he did have that Dana White Contender Series fight recently where he got that round 1 submission victory against Billy Brand. Impressive performance overall. The guy always seems to get it done. His only loss was all the way back in 2021. But let's talk about all the intangibles that are really leaning towards this kid's favor and why he's likely going to win on this Saturday. So the first thing to talk about, the elephant in the room, is the striking advantage. He has a striking advantage not only on paper, but if you look at the way that he strikes and the way that he fights, it's a clear stylistic advantage that I think if he really works on and improves over time, it is a strength of his that can really propel him to the top here. Now, I will also be a little bit bold as to say that I like how he looks when it comes to submission defense and grappling and kind of that grappling offense as well. I will say, of course, do not forget, Dan Argueta, he's one of those relentless wrestler type of fighters, but I like that Haddon has kind of demonstrated some good grappling skills, and I think that that might neutralize some of the threat that Dan Argueta is posing in this fight. Keep in mind, Haddon did go 3 rounds with flyweight contender Steve Erceg all the way back in 2021, so he has been able to hang with up-and-coming fighters. And Steve Erceg, I mean, not the best grappler on the planet, but still, you know, he does have some grappling talent that deserves some acknowledgement. Now, Haddon also has shown submission skills of his own. Of course, keep in mind his recent victory that kind of supports that. I like the momentum that he brings and also some of the experience that he has. I honestly think that as the fight goes on, there's going to be a higher likelihood of Cody Haddon getting the submission in this fight, especially in those later rounds, like maybe the 3rd round specifically. So his striking should be able to kind of wear down Argueta over time a little bit and then create some openings for takedowns and eventually even submissions as Argueta gets a little bit tired from all of that effort. So keep in mind, Haddon has to be a little bit careful here because Dan does have kind of a relentless pace, and his wrestling could pose some challenges early on in this fight, but I think Haddon's a little bit more well-rounded and he has some potential, so I'm going to be leaning towards him. Final verdict, I'm taking Cody Haddon via submission, probably rolling the dice a little bit on that, but I'm thinking that that's where this fight's going to go. Now, we were supposed to have Chris Barnett versus Junior Tafa, which was going to be a very interesting fight. I was going for the underdog there, Chris Barnett. However, unfortunately, that fight was canceled. So the next fight that I have to cover, oh, by the way, if you don't know, the reason that that fight was canceled, I believe was due to the Hurricane Milton, which is going to be hitting Florida. If you're in Florida, hope you're doing safe. Hope you've evacuated. Please check in with your family and friends. Make sure everyone's doing all right. I think it's going to be one of the worst hurricanes, or maybe the 2nd worst hurricane of all time or something. They're hyping it up, but I don't know. Anyways, unfortunately, we just lost Chris Barnett versus Junior Tafa. I was going for the underdog there. I honestly thought that Chris Barnett was going to defeat Junior Tafa, and I would have loved to cover that and talk about it. But without further ado, let's just jump into the next fight here. Themba Gorimbo versus Niko Price. So let's talk about these guys' stats. We have Gorimbo, who's 6 feet 1 inch tall. He has a reach of 77 inches, and he's 33 years old. Now, on the other hand, we have Niko Price. He's 6 feet tall with a reach of 76 inches, and he's 35 years old. So a 1 inch height disadvantage, a 1 inch reach disadvantage, and he's 2 years older, Niko Price, of course. Now, when it comes to striking, Themba, he lands 2.53 strikes per minute with a 69% accuracy, which is pretty high for accuracy when it comes to striking. Now, Niko, on the other hand, he lands 5.65 strikes per minute at a 43% accuracy. As far as grappling goes, Gorimbo, he lands 4.04 takedowns on average with a 58% accuracy. Now, Niko, on the other hand, he lands 1.15 takedowns on average with a 32% accuracy. Now lastly, when it comes to defense, Gorimbo, he absorbs only 1.08 strikes per minute with a 46% striking defense and a 78% takedown defense, whereas Niko absorbs way more strikes per minute at 5.7 strikes with a 49% striking defense and a 62% takedown defense. Now let's take a look at Themba Gorimbo's recent fight history. Now recently he's coming off of that win against Ramiz Brahmaj, which was via unanimous decision back in May of this year, a few months ago. Now his total record, 13 wins and 4 losses. Out of those 13 wins, 2 of them were KO/TKOs, 6 of those were submissions, and 5 were decision victories, which gives him a pretty decent 62% finishing rate. Out of his 4 losses, 1 of those was a KO/TKO, 2 of those were submission losses, and the last one was a decision loss. He does have 5 first-round finishes out of his 13 wins, and recently he's won 4 out of his last 5 fights, and he's coming off of 3 back-to-back-to-back wins into this fight. His most recent win was back in May of 2024. His most recent loss was back in February of last year in 2023. Now flipping over to Niko Price, let's take a look at his recent fight history. He's coming off that win against Alex Morono, who's also on this card, and that was via unanimous decision back in June of this year. Now, Niko's total record is 16 wins, 7 losses. Out of those 16 wins, 10 of those were KO/TKOs, 3 were submissions, and 3 were decision victories, which gives him a respectable 81% finishing rate. Out of his 7 losses, 5 of those were KO/TKOs, so he's a little bit vulnerable when it comes to that. He has 1 submission loss as well and 1 decision loss. He does have 10 first-round finishes out of his 16 wins, which is insane. Recently, though, he's only won 2 of his last 5 fights, but he is coming off of a win into this particular fight. Now, his most recent win, June of this year, and his most recent loss was back in July of last year in 2023. Now let's take a look at what my prediction models predicted, their weighted average for this fight, and then my final pick that takes that and also incorporates all the other non-stat based research that I do, including watching fight film, including qualitative research about these fighters, their training, some of their weaknesses, any injuries that were recent, stuff of that nature that statistical models can't pick up, because we need human input plus some statistical analysis, and that's always the most well-rounded pick. So in terms of the statistical models, all 7 are leaning towards Themba Gorimbo and none are leaning towards Niko Price, and when I weigh those together, I'm getting an 82% probability of victory for Themba Gorimbo to win. And then for my final prediction, what I did was I kind of knocked that down a little bit, just slightly, to 79%. And I think that you got to keep in mind Niko Price does land 3.12 more strikes per minute, and he has a 3% higher striking defense as well. Just a couple key stats, and you know, there's also some qualitative reasons as to why I knocked that down just a little bit. But the reason that I am leaning towards Themba here is due to the fact that he does have a height advantage of 1 inch. He is slightly younger at 2 years younger. He does have a reach advantage of 1 inch as well. He has a 26% higher striking accuracy. He absorbs 4.6 less strikes per minute. He lands 2.9 more takedowns on average. He has a 26% higher takedown accuracy and a 16% higher takedown defense. Taking a look at his record, he's won 13 fights. He's finished 62% of those. He's had 4 fights within the UFC, of which he's won 3. Now, recently, he's won 4 of his last 5 fights. He's done really well. He's carrying a lot of momentum. In fact, he's on a 3-fight win streak coming into this very fight. But let's talk about all those reasons aside from just the stats alone as to why I'm strongly leaning towards Themba Gorimbo to win. Now, the first thing that I want to highlight is the grappling advantage that Gorimbo has. I think he's going to definitely lean towards his wrestling and grappling skills against Price. He not only statistically weighs heavily when it comes to that grappling kind of advantage, but also stylistically does very well with that. And so I think he's going to look for those submissions or even those ground and pound opportunities. I've also noticed that his striking has improved compared to some of his earlier fights and him more recently. So I think that his striking is going to be a little bit more faster and more explosive as well compared to Price, with a little bit cleaner of a technique. So I think he's going to mix up his attacks a little bit and use those strikes to maybe set up those takedowns and vice versa. Now, I also think he's going to exploit some of Price's weaknesses, and let me kind of go in depth as to what I mean. Price has a little bit of a sloppy striking technique, and it doesn't come with a lot of defense either. And when it comes to his chin, I think it's gotten a little bit weaker over time as well. So Gorimbo could easily take advantage of this fight by being able to find openings and landing some of those clean shots straight down the middle, also using his speed and his explosiveness to catch Price a little bit off guard and keep him on the back foot, and also potentially securing a knockout if he's able to connect a little bit cleanly and go from there. Now, I will also say when it comes to pace and conditioning, Gorimbo is known for pushing a relentless and consistent pace throughout fights, and I think that that will inevitably wear down Price, especially if Gorimbo's able to control some of those grappling exchanges and force Price to carry his weight a little bit. So overall strategy would be strike from the outside to set up some of those takedown attempts, secure takedowns and dominate on the ground, and then also potentially find a submission or even just get a TKO finish if the opportunity arises. I think the odds are a little bit, it's more probable for a TKO finish in this fight. I don't think I see Gorimbo necessarily getting a submission victory. So bottom line, final verdict, Themba Gorimbo via KO/TKO. There's not much more to it in this fight. For the next fight, we have Jonathan Pearce versus Pat Sabatini. Now let's go to review their stats here. Jonathan is 6 feet tall with a reach of 71 inches and he's 32 years old. And on the other hand, Pat is 5 feet 8 inches tall with a reach of 70 inches and he's 33 years old. When it comes to striking, Jonathan lands 5.32 strikes per minute with a 54% accuracy. Now Pat, on the other hand, he lands more than, or less than half of that, I should say, at 2.02 strikes per minute, but with a little bit better accuracy at 59%. But what good is that if the discrepancy is so large? Now, as far as grappling goes, Jonathan Pearce lands 5.24 takedowns on average with a 50% accuracy. Now, Pat, on the other hand, 3.73 takedowns on average, so that's about 2 less takedowns on average, or 1.5 at a 42% accuracy. That's a 8% less accurate rate. Now lastly, when it comes to defense, Jonathan does absorb 3.43 strikes per minute with a 54% striking defense and a 58% takedown defense, whereas Pat absorbs 1.54 strikes per minute with a 49% striking defense and a 50% takedown defense. Now let's take a look at Jonathan Pearce's recent fight history. Now recently, Jonathan is coming off of that loss against David Onama, which was via unanimous decision back in April of this year. Now his total record, 14 wins and 6 losses. Out of those 14 wins, 9 of those were KO/TKOs, 2 were submissions, and 3 were decision victories, which does give him a 79% finishing rate. Out of his 6 losses, 1 was a KO/TKO, 3 of those were submission losses, and 2 were decision losses. He does have 1 single first round finish. Recently he's done decent. He's won 3 of his last 5 fights, but he is coming off of back-to-back losses into this fight, so he's not carrying a lot of good momentum with him. Most recent win was back in December of 2022, and his most recent loss was back in April of 2024. Now let's take a look at Pat's recent fight history. Now recently, Pat is coming off of that loss against Diego Lopez via KO/TKO back in November of last year, 2023. Now his total record, 18 wins and 5 losses. Out of those 18 wins, 2 of those were KO/TKOs, 11 of those were submissions, which is a huge highlight, and 5 were decision victories, still giving him a 72% finishing rate. Out of his 5 losses, 3 of those were KO/TKOs and the other 2 were decision losses. He does have 7 first round finishes out of his 18 wins. Recently he's won 3 of his last 5 fights, but he is coming off of a loss from Diego Lopez into this fight. His most recent win was back in June of last year, and his most recent loss was in November of last year. Now let's take a look at what my prediction models predicted for this fight, their weighted average, and then my final pick that takes that and also incorporates other non-stat based research and fight film study observations as well. 3 of 7 of my prediction models are leaning towards Jonathan Pearce and 4 are leaning towards Pat. Now when I weigh those together, I'm getting a 51% probability victory for Jonathan. Now for my final prediction, I am going to go with Jonathan here, but I'm going to give him a little bit more confidence. I'm giving him a 55% probability victory. That's due to the fact that Jonathan does have a height advantage of 4 inches here. He is a little bit younger, about 1 year. He has a reach advantage of 1 inch as well. He lands 3.3 more strikes per minute, which is key. He has a 5% higher striking defense as well. He lands 1.51 more takedowns on average, which is another key. And he has an 8% higher takedown accuracy with an 8% higher takedown defense as well. Looking at his record, once again, 14 fights that he's won. He's finished 79% of those. He's had 8 fights within the UFC, of which he's won 5, which is pretty good overall. Recently, he's won 3 of his last 5 fights as well. But let's talk about all the intangibles as to why I'm leaning towards Jonathan Pearce here. So for starters, I want to highlight the striking advantage that Pearce has. I think he has a huge advantage when it comes to striking, and he's shown his really good striking skills overall, particularly with some of those front kicks that he really uses, and also his jab. I really like his jab. Now, Sabatini, on the other hand, his arms are kind of little looking. I mean, you know, he got those little T-Rex arms, as people might say. Now, he's not the best also when it comes to striking defense. So when it comes to just striking in general, I think Pearce has a very strong advantage here. Also, we touched base on this a little bit, but I'm just going to recap. I think that he has a lot of physical advantages as well. So Pearce, he's kind of the longer fighter. He has those longer arms and limbs, and I think that that kind of advantage, it does definitely help fighters. You know, it allows them to kind of keep fighters at bay and land some of those strikes from a little bit of a safer distance, and they're just more effective overall if they're used properly. You know, I'm giving the benefit of the doubt here and kind of expecting this guy to know how to strike, which in MMA does not always seem to be the case. So I digress. Anyways, I will also say I like Pearce's takedown defense overall. Now, it may not seem very good on paper, but I have kind of seen him in fights use a little bit of his wrestling in order to reverse and keep fights a little bit where he wants them, you know, especially when it comes to the scramble and things of that nature. So I know that if he gets into a little bit of a sticky situation, he could kind of neutralize Sabatini's grappling threat a little bit based on that. I will say that Pat's also not the most durable fighter, whereas Pearce, on the other hand, he has shown some durability in his fights, and he has shown an ability to push a hard pace as well. So overall, here's what I think Pearce is going to do in this fight. I think he's going to use his jab and front kicks to maintain the distance in this fight. If the fight ends up in a sprawl type of situation, he's going to be successful in that sprawl, and he's going to be able to defend some of those takedowns and keep the fight standing overall, kind of pop back up. Also, I think he's going to be able to accumulate some damage over time with his striking and eventually try to set up and look for a TKO finish if he can, or at least get the fight to the judges and show that he can control the fight overall. And I think that that's more likely to happen overall. I could see Jonathan Pearce just kind of controlling the fight overall, getting the job done, getting that decision victory, instead of him necessarily getting a finish. If he does get a finish, I'd be a little bit surprised, and I would say that, you know, he's more explosive than I thought, but I see this going as Jonathan getting that decision victory. For the next fight, we have an interesting matchup. We have CJ Vergara versus Ramazan Temirov. Now let's go ahead and review their stats here. CJ Vergara is 5 feet 6 inches tall with a reach of 68 inches, and he's 33 years old. Now on the other hand, we have this guy named Ramazan. He doesn't really have any kind of stats recorded. We don't know his height or reach necessarily. We do know he's 27 years old, and he's absolutely friggin' shredded if you've seen this guy. Now let's talk about striking. CJ Vergara, he lands 5.24 strikes per minute with a 57% accuracy. Now Ramazan, on the other hand, he doesn't really have anything recorded, so bear with me as I go through what is available on these guys. So when it comes to defense, CJ Vergara, he absorbs 4.62 strikes per minute with a 52% striking defense and a 60% takedown defense. Again, don't really have a lot of statistical info on Ramazan, but we could definitely talk about what we know when it comes to his fighting game plan and the strengths and weaknesses. So I'll definitely dive into that when it comes to the predictions. But first, let's take a look at these guys' records. Starting with CJ Vergara. So recently he's coming off of that loss against Asu Almabayev, which was via unanimous decision back in March of this year. Now looking at his total record, 12 wins and 5 losses. Out of those 12 wins, 7 of those KO/TKOs and the other 5 decision victories, which gives him a 58% finishing rate. Now out of his 5 losses, 2 of those were submission losses and the remaining 3 were decision losses. He does have 2 first round finishes. Recently he's done decent. He's won 3 of his last 5 fights, but he is coming off of a loss most recently into this fight. His most recent win was back in July of 2023, and his most recent loss was earlier this year back in March of 2024. Now let's take a look at Ramazan Temirov's recent fight history. Now recently he's coming off of that win against Takaki Soya, which was back in September of 2023. Now this guy's total record, 17 wins and 2 losses. Out of his 17 wins, 10 of those were KO/TKOs, of which out of his 17 wins, he's had 11 first round finishes. So all those KO/TKOs were within the very first round. He also has 1 submission victory as well, which is that other finish within the first round, and then he has 6 decision victories. All in all, 65% finish rate. His only 2 losses, 1 was a submission and the other was a decision loss. Recently, he's won all 5 of his previous 5 fights. In fact, the guy's on a 9-fight win streak. His most recent win was back in September of 2023. His most recent loss was actually in September of 2019. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't run both of these fighters through the prediction models because of the debut here. However, let's take a look at the odd probabilities and also discuss all the qualitative factors that I was able to gather on both of these guys. So the odds themselves are giving Ramazan Temirov a 69.6% probability of victory. That's about a 70% very confident prediction there. So Ramazan, the statistical thing's going in his favor here. He's 6 years younger than his opponent here. He's won 17 fights, finished 65% of those. He's won all of his previous 5 fights. In fact, he's on that 9-fight crazy win streak. But now I really want to focus on those intangibles because that's what we're really left with when you strip down all the baseline stats for this fight. So starting with striking power, man, Temirov, he's expected to have a huge advantage when it comes to striking power. Keep in mind, this guy has had a ton of KOs first round in his record. He's been able to kind of prove that his hands he has heavy hands, you know, and that's going to be a little bit of a danger zone for CJ Vergara, especially early on in that first or even second round. Now, I will also say, I touched base a little bit on this earlier, his form. He's entering in this fight with a crazy win streak. He hasn't lost since 2019. The guy's absolutely shredded, very athletic. You know, he's in shape, ready to fight, ready to go. And I think that's good. You know, I don't want to see someone just enter the UFC and debut and they don't even look the part. So the guy definitely looks the part. There's a lot of hype on him, actually, and I don't always necessarily believe the hype, but keep in mind, he's done very well in Ryzen. If you know if you don't know what Ryzen is, it's another promotion. Highly recommend you just take a look at it, see some of the highlights overall in Ryzen. They have a lot of great talent, and a lot of those guys have even came into the UFC and they've done very, very well, such as Yuri Prohaska, who was in fact Ryzen Fighting Federation's light heavyweight champion. So a lot of these guys that go into Ryzen, they're very talented. Of course, Yuri, he comes with his flaws, right? Especially when it comes to his defense, but we still know the guy is absolutely talented. Anyways, I've deviated way too much. I will also say that he's 27 years old. Temirov, he's in his prime. He's going to be very athletic. He's going to have a lot of speed with him. And I think CJ Vergara, it's going to be a lot of pressure on him, especially when it comes to just the mental aspect of this game. Everything depends on how CJ Vergara is going to react in this situation. If he's calm and he's able to kind of stick to his game plan overall and just stomp him out, prove the doubters wrong, then he's going to be able to win. If he gets a little bit nervous, which, let's be honest here, I expect him to be a little bit nervous. If he gets nervous, I don't expect him to do too well. Playing devil's advocate here, sometimes these guys who make a debut, they have a lot of hype on them, they end up not doing too well, if I'm being honest, and a lot of you are aware of that. Some of you may not be, but they don't necessarily do well just because they have hype or just because they did really well in a previous promotion. It's not necessarily a formula for success, but these are things to keep in mind when it comes to the psychological aspect of who has an advantage and who doesn't in a fight. Anyways, let's talk game plan here. So while Temirov's knockout power is really highlighted, I think that he could also potentially exploit Vergara's weak ground game. Now, if you take a look at one of those recent losses that CJ Vergara faced, he gave up a ton of takedowns in that fight. So it's not even like I could say that Vergara has a huge advantage there. The guy's just not very good, and I think that Temirov is going to come in and kind of prove himself. And that's what it's going to take. Bottom line, this guy has to come in and kind of prove himself. Otherwise, it's going to be another failed debut, and we've seen a ton of those, especially this year. So bottom line, though, I do expect Ramazan Temirov to do pretty good. I think he's actually going to get another finish. I'm expecting it to be in the first round. Worst case scenario, second round, but I do expect him to get a finish in this matchup. I think it's going to be an exciting debut overall. For the next fight, we have Chidi Njokuani versus Gooden. Let's go and review their stats here. Chidi is 6 feet 3 inches tall with a reach of 80 inches, and he's 35 years old. Now, on the other hand, we have Gooden, who's 6 feet tall, which is 3 inches shorter. He has a reach of 77 inches, which is 3 inches shorter as well, but he is 5 years younger at 30 years old. When it comes to striking, Chidi lands 4.09 strikes per minute at a 61% accuracy, while Jared, on the other hand, lands 5.08 strikes per minute at a 49% accuracy. So that's one more strike per minute, but at a 10% less accuracy rate. So as far as grappling goes, now Chidi doesn't really have anything recorded in terms of grappling, and Jared has very little recorded, or very little meaningful stats recorded. He has 0.67 takedowns on average with a decent accuracy, but obviously not a huge part of the overall game plan. When it comes to defense, Chidi absorbs 2.94 strikes per minute with a 55% striking defense and a 74% takedown defense. Now Jared, on the other hand, he absorbs much more at 6.7 strikes per minute with a 48% striking defense and a 65% takedown defense. Now let's take a look at Chidi's recent fight history. Now recently, Chidi is coming off of that win against Maurice McKee, which was via split decision back in March of this year. His total record is 23 wins and 10 losses. Out of those 23 wins, 14 of those were KO/TKOs, of which he's had 10 first-round finishes overall. His other victory was a submission, and the remaining 8 were decision victories. All in all, the guy has a 65% finish rate. Now, out of his 10 losses, 5 of those were via KO/TKO, 3 of those were via submission, and 2 were decision losses. So again, 10 first-round finishes, absolutely insane. Recently, not doing too well. He's only won 2 of his last 5 fights, but he did turn it around, and he's coming off of a win into this particular fight. Again, most recent win back in March of this year, split decision victory. Most recent loss was back in August of last year. Now let's take a look at Jared's recent fight history. Now recently, Jared is coming off of that win against Wellington Turman, which was via submission back in December of last year in 2023. Now, Jared's total record, 23 wins and 9 losses. Out of those 23 wins, 11 of those were KO/TKOs, 7 of those were submissions, and 5 were decision victories, which does give him a 78% finishing rate. Out of his 9 losses, 2 of those were KO/TKOs, and the remaining 7 were decision losses. He does have 4 first-round finishes out of his 23 wins. Not something that's very consistent, but still. Recently, he's done decent. He's won 3 of his last 5 fights, and he is coming off of a win into this particular fight. Most recent win, again, December of 2023. Most recent loss back in March of 2023. Now let's take a look at what my prediction models predicted, their weighted average, and then my final pick that takes that and also incorporates other non-stat based research and fight film studying that I do offhand. So 7 of my 7 prediction models are leaning towards Chidi, and none are leaning towards Jared here. And when I weigh them together, I'm getting a 67% probability victory for Chidi. Now for my final prediction, I'm going to knock that down just a little bit at 65%. And that's due to the fact that Jared Gooden, he is 5 years younger. He does land 0.99 more strikes per minute, which is 1 pretty much. Let's just round that up. But the reason that I am leaning towards Chidi is due to the fact that Chidi does have a height advantage of 3 inches. He has a reach advantage of 3 inches. He has a 12% higher striking accuracy. He absorbs 3.74 less strikes per minute. He has a 8% higher striking defense and a 9% higher takedown defense as well. At least those are the statistical reasons as to why I'm leaning towards Chidi. Now, looking at his record, Chidi has won 23 fights. He's finished 65% of those. He's had 6 fights in the UFC, of which he's won half of those. He's won 3 of those. Now, recently, I understand that he hasn't done too well, but I think a lot of the intangibles that this guy has and a lot of the qualitative factors that he has also play a huge role as to why I think he's going to win and defeat his opponent in this fight. So let's talk about all of those. Starting with the overall striking advantage, I think that Njokuani, he's going to have quite a bit of a striking advantage in this fight. I think that he's a very good striker, and he has great speed, power, and also distance control, I should say. Now, he's one of those technical striking type of fighters, and I think that those types of skills are going to be a little bit more superior compared to Gooden's skill set, who's kind of known for a little bit more of a wide style, winging striking style. And when you see guys do that, it's kind of like, you know, it's kind of like they're a chicken. And I'm not saying chicken like he's scared or something, but the guy has these triangular wide posture. I want you to imagine a chicken, right? You see how their wings are kind of to the side of their body. That's kind of how I imagine some of these guys that just leave themselves some like wide open. And unfortunately, not to call Jared Gooden a chicken at all. I mean all sorts of respect to the guy, but I just don't think that he's fundamentally or technically sound when it comes to striking defense. And I think that what Chidi does that some people highlight, but not a lot of people give him credit for, is using his range control. Keep in mind, this guy's very tall and he has a great reach as well. I think he was 6 feet 3 inches tall, or maybe 6 feet 3 inches tall, and he has like an 80-inch reach, 3 inches taller and a 3-inch longer reach. I think he's going to use that very well. And the guys that use this, they're going to be more of your technical guys. The guys who actually use range control and they use their advantages, their limb advantages, their height advantages very well. It's those technical type of fighters that do it very well. So I think I'm probably beating the bush a little bit too much, but range control is going to be a huge part of Chidi's game plan here. Technical approach is also going to be a huge part. I think he's going to be very methodical in this fight. He's going to look for kind of a early finish. I don't think he's going to quite get the finish, but he's going to be hunting for it. I think this fight is going to go to the judges, and he's going to get a unanimous decision victory. The guy has very good striking again. He's able to measure his pace very well, kind of keep that same pace going throughout the fight. I like his striking technique overall, and I think that Jared just doesn't have what it takes to kind of go up against a guy like that. You always have your MMA miracles and your MMA luck, right? Because not everything is 100% going to play out accurately. But if we are just talking straight logic, Chidi should have this. I also like Chidi's defensive skills overall. I like his movement and kind of his ability to avoid being hit. If you see some of his footage, he's kind of evasive as a fighter, which I really like, especially when I'm trying to pick one of my fighters. I like a lot of defensive maneuvering and skills like that. Chidi has that, and I like that, and that kind of allows him to avoid significant damage compared to if he didn't have that. So I think that we might get a knockout, but I really don't think that that will be the case. I'm leaning more towards a decision for Chidi here, and I think he's just going to consistently outstrike Gooden throughout this fight and kind of avoid any kind of major damage as long as he's kind of smart about it. Chidi should be able to secure a victory here. For the next fight, we have Abdul Razak Alhassan versus Josh Fremd. Let's go and review their stats here. Abdul is 5 feet 10 inches tall with a reach of 73 inches, and he's 39 years old. Now, on the other hand, we have Josh, who is 6 feet 4 inches tall. He has a 6-inch height advantage here. He has a 3-inch reach advantage with a 76-inch reach, and he is 9 years younger at 30 years old. Now, let's talk about striking here. Abdul, he lands 3.62 strikes per minute with a 49% accuracy. Now, Josh, on the other hand, he lands 2.52 strikes per minute with a 44% accuracy. As far as grappling goes, Abdul, he lands 0.88 takedowns on average with a 38% accuracy. Now Josh, on the other hand, he lands 0.66 takedowns on average with a 25% accuracy. Not a huge part of either guy's game plan, but still there in general, right? Now lastly, when it comes to defense, we have Abdul with a 3.97 absorption rate with a 55% striking defense and a 51% takedown defense, whereas Josh, on the other hand, he absorbs 2.23 strikes per minute with a 47% striking defense and a 30% takedown defense. So let's take a look at Abdul Razak Alhassan's recent fight history. Now, recently, let's kind of review what happened in his fight with Cody Brundage here. It was ruled a no contest, but let's talk about what happened. So the fight began with Cody Brundage. There was an intense exchange overall. Brundage was attempting a takedown early on. However, Alhassan, he quickly kind of gained the upper hand overall and started delivering just a series of crazy strikes. And as he was kind of close to finishing the fight, he landed multiple strikes to the back of Brundage's head, which of course were illegal. So Dan Murgliata, at that point, he intervened and he kind of halted the action due to those illegal strikes, and Brundage was given like a 5-minute recovery period, you know, of course, just usual type of stuff. What ended up happening was Brundage told the ringside guy that he was kind of unable to continue fighting, and what ended up happening was there was a no contest. And this was all within 37 seconds of the very first round. This was a little bit of a controversy overall, and you know, people were debating left and right. Some people were making the argument that Brundage made the right decision not to continue and there were health risks and blah, blah, blah. And other people were saying that, hey, Alhassan, you know, despite the ruling, there was only really one questionable illegal shot, and Brundage, they were kind of saying Brundage was ducking and dodging any kind of further competition with the guy. So that was just the debate overall. I wanted to give you guys that quick context here, but let's just dive right back in. So recently, Alhassan's coming off of that weird no count situation with Cody Brundage. That was back in July of this year, very recent. Now let's zoom out a little bit. Let's just look at his total record: 12 wins, 6 losses. Out of his 12 wins, all of those were KO/TKOs, which is huge. That gives him a 100% finishing rate. Let's break down his 6 losses here. 1 was a KO/TKO, 1 was a submission, and 4 were decision losses. So he has all of those first round finishes, absolutely insane. Recently though, he hasn't done too well. He's only won 2 of his last 5 fights, and recently coming off of that weird situation with Cody Brundage. His most recent win was actually back in January of 2023, and his most recent loss was actually back in October of 2023. Now let's flip over to Josh's recent fight history. Now recently, Josh is coming off of that loss against Andre Petroski via unanimous decision back in July of 2024. Man, Andre Petroski, he's been in the game for so freaking long, but I'm not going to deviate here. I'm just going to stay on path. So Josh's total record: 11 wins, 6 losses. Out of his 11 wins, 4 of those were KO/TKOs, 4 were submissions, and 3 were decision victories, which gives the guy a 73% finishing rate. Out of his 6 losses, 2 of those were KO/TKOs, 1 was a submission loss, and the remaining 3 were decision losses. He does have 3 first-round finishes out of his 11 wins, not too bad overall, but recently, very similar to Abdul, he's only won 2 of his last 5 fights, and he's currently coming off of back-to-back losses, so he doesn't carry a lot of momentum with him, of course, coming into this fight. In fact, his most recent win was back in August of 2023, and his most recent loss was back in July of 2024. Now let's take a look at what my prediction models predicted for this fight, their weighted average, and then my final pick that takes that and also adds the other qualitative factors and fight film study observations and all of those intangibles, right? So starting with the predictions here, prediction models, all 7 are leaning towards Abdul Razak Alhassan and none are leaning towards Josh Fremd. When I weigh those prediction models together, I'm getting a 72.3% probability victory for Abdul. Now for my final prediction, I'm going to knock that down just a little bit. I'm going to give him a 69% probability victory. And that's due to the fact that Josh does have a height advantage of 6 inches here. He's also 9 years younger. He has a reach advantage of 3 inches. He absorbs 1.74 less strikes per minute, and he lands 0.9 more submissions on average as well. So I'm giving him a little bit of respect there. Now, the reason I am picking Abdul here is due to the fact that Abdul does land 1 more strike per minute. He does have a 5% better striking accuracy, he has a 9% higher striking defense, and he lands 0.22 more takedowns on average. Also, he has a 13% higher takedown accuracy and a 21% higher takedown defense. Keep in mind, this guy's won 12 fights. He's finished 100% of those. He's had 13 fights in the UFC, of which he's won 6, just about half. But recently, of course, I do acknowledge he hasn't done the absolute best. Both guys are kind of weak when it comes to recent momentum. Both have only won 2 of their last 5 fights. But let's talk about all the intangibles as to why I'm really leaning towards Abdul here and leaning towards him to win. The first one is extremely obvious. It has to be Alhassan's knockout power. He's known for that explosive knockout power. All of his wins, again, came via KO/TKO, and he's proven that the guy definitely has power in his hands. Also, kind of piggybacking off of that, I will say that he has a very solid striking advantage in this matchup. Alhassan, he throws a lot of volume and he has more power, and that's a very dangerous combination when you have 2 of those things together. Also, Josh has a little bit of a vulnerability here, especially when it comes to really good strikers and powerful strikers. We saw how he did against Roman Kopylov and Gregory Rodriguez. I'm not saying Roman Kopylov is necessarily a very powerful striker, but still, someone who's a very good striker. He had a weakness with those kind of fighters. Now, Alhassan, obviously, just looking at his previous weird fight alone, this guy really starts the fight very aggressively within the first round. He's looking for that quick finish because that's obviously a huge strength of his. It's a natural advantage in his game, so he's going to really lean into that. And I think that that kind of thing is going to, it's going to kind of overwhelm Josh here. Now, taking cardio into consideration, I thought about it, I researched. Now, Alhassan, he's kind of shown a little bit of a cardio limitation. So I will acknowledge that when it comes to those longer fights, he has a little bit of a limitation in that sense. But then again, he's not aiming to take the fight that long. The guy's either looking to kill or be killed, pretty much. Now, Josh, he's also not really known for pushing a high pace either. And that kind of just reduces the likelihood overall of the fight kind of extending beyond Alhassan's cardio and comfort zone. So that's why I don't necessarily think cardio is a disadvantage here for Alhassan, because I don't really expect this fight to go the distance. I mean, it's not like Josh is one of those guys that will take this fight to the distance anyways. So all in all, I do expect a finish from Abdul Razak Alhassan. I think it's going to be an exciting moment. It's going to bring a little bit life back into this card, maybe after a couple of dull fights or something like that. Because, you know, sometimes fights don't play out the way they should, and then we just all of a sudden get this crazy knockout and we're like, whoa, this fight's already over within 30 seconds. Well, that's the kind of fighter that Alhassan is, and I hope he really brings it this Saturday, because that's what us fans want sometimes. We want some explosive action, you know. We work hard all week. We just want to see some crazy good fights and a crazy good finish. Up next, we have Daniel Rodriguez versus Alex Morono. Let's go and review their stats here. Daniel Rodriguez is 6 feet 1 inch tall with a reach of 74 inches, and he's 37 years old. Then we have Alex Morono, who's 5 feet 11 inches tall. That's a 2-inch height disadvantage here. He also has a 2-inch reach disadvantage as he has 72-inch reach. And he's... For the next fight, we have Daniel Rodriguez versus Alex Morono. Let's go and review their stats here. Daniel Rodriguez is 6 feet 1 inch tall with a reach of 74 inches, and he's 37 years old. Now, on the other hand, Alex Morono is 2 inches shorter at 5 feet 11 inches tall. He also has a 2-inch less reach at 72 inches, and he is slightly younger at 34 years old. He's 3 years younger. So let's talk about striking. Daniel lands 7.42 strikes per minute with a 49% accuracy. Now, Alex, not only does he land about 3 less strikes per minute at 4.96, but he also has an 8% less accurate rate of striking at 41%. Now, as far as grappling goes, Daniel Rodriguez lands 0.55 takedowns on average at a 50% accuracy, while Alex lands 0.36 takedowns on average at a 26% accuracy. And lastly, when it comes to defense, Daniel Rodriguez absorbs 5.52 strikes per minute with a 56% striking defense and a 56% takedown defense, whereas Alex, on the other hand, he absorbs 4.34 strikes per minute with a 57% striking defense and a 48% takedown defense. Now let's take a look at Daniel's recent fight history. Now recently he is coming off of that loss against Kelvin Gastelum via unanimous decision. That was back in June of this year. His total record is 17 wins and 5 losses. Out of his 17 wins, 8 of those were KO/TKOs, 4 were submissions, and 5 were decision victories, which gives him a 71% finishing rate. Out of his 5 losses, 1 of those was a KO/TKO, 1 was a submission loss, and the remaining 3 were decision losses. He does have 5 first-round finishes out of his 17 wins. Recently, though, he's only won 2 of his last 5 fights. In fact, he's coming off of 3 back-to-back-to-back losses in this particular matchup. His most recent win was back in September of 2022, so it's been 2 years, and his most recent loss was back in June of 2024. Now let's take a look at Alex Morono's recent fight history. And recently, Alex is coming off of that loss against Niko Price, who was also fighting on this card, and that was via unanimous decision back in June of this year. Now his total record, 23 wins and 10 losses. Out of those 23 wins, 6 of those were KO/TKOs, 7 of those were submissions, and 10 were decision victories, which does give him a 54% finishing rate. Out of his 10 losses, 3 were KO/TKOs and 7 were decision losses. He does have 11 first-round finishes, but recently he's only won 2 of his last 5 fights, and he is coming off of a loss into this fight. His momentum isn't as bad as Daniel Rodriguez's, but he is still coming off of a loss here, and he's only won 2 of his 5. So anyways, his most recent win was back in April of 2024, and his most recent loss, keep in mind, was in June of this year, just a few months ago. Now let's take a look at what my prediction models predicted, their weighted average, and then my final pick that takes that and adds other non-stat based research and fight film study observations and takes all of that into account as well. So starting with the prediction models, 7 of my 7 prediction models are leaning towards Daniel Rodriguez, none are leaning towards Alex Morono. When I weigh those together, I'm getting an 80% probability of victory for Daniel. Now for my final prediction, I'm going to kind of knock that down just a little bit. I'm giving Daniel a 75% probability of victory. That's due to the fact that I will acknowledge that Alex, he is 3 years younger. He absorbs 1.18 less strikes per minute. He has a 1% higher striking defense, and he lands about 0.3 more submissions on average. A little bit of a statistical edge in those different factors, but I am still leaning towards Daniel Rodriguez. Keep in mind, Daniel Rodriguez has a height advantage of 2 inches here. He has a reach advantage of 2 inches here. He lands 2.46 more strikes per minute, which is pretty good volume per minute. He has an 8% higher striking accuracy. He lands 0.19 more takedowns on average. He has a 24% higher takedown accuracy, and he has a 9% higher takedown defense overall. Now, Daniel's won 17 fights. He's finished 71% of those. He's had 11 fights in the UFC, of which he's won 7, so he's done well overall. But recently, I know he doesn't really have the momentum to back it up, but I still think he has a lot of intangibles that should get him a victory over a guy like Alex Morono. I don't think Daniel Rodriguez is like the greatest fighter on the planet, but I think that in this matchup, it's kind of obvious Daniel Rodriguez will win, and I'm going to talk about why right now. For starters, I want to highlight the striking advantage that Daniel Rodriguez has in this matchup. Not only does he average more strikes per minute, but his striking rate is more likely going to outpoint Morono and kind of just wear him down over the course of the fight. And not only that, but he's also going to keep a lot of control throughout the fight. Keep in mind, Rodriguez does have a reach advantage here and a height advantage here, and so he's going to be able to use that a lot. And also, one thing that probably doesn't get talked about enough is that Rodriguez is a southpaw. He's not orthodox, while Morono, he is orthodox. So that could make it a little bit challenging for Morono to kind of close the distance effectively. That's what happens when you take an orthodox guy and put him up against a southpaw. It's kind of hard to kind of close that distance a little bit. And I think that eventually that's going to allow Rodriguez to utilize his jab, and it will have an impact throughout the fight, especially his straight left. When you take a look at that range, he's going to be able to leverage that straight left very well in this fight. At least I expect him to. His recent form as well, I will say Rodriguez, although he's kind of on that losing streak that we talked about, he has faced tougher competition overall, and sometimes that experience is valuable. He fought Neil Magny, he fought Kevin Lee. Some of those like good experiences I think will help him adjust to Alex Morono, who's a little bit of a step down, and I say that with a ton of respect. I don't mean to be disrespectful. I will also say Rodriguez, we know him to be a pressure style fighter and also a volume striker overall. If he can kind of keep that pace and keep Morono on his back foot, again, it'll feed into him wearing him down over the course of 3 rounds. Morono has shown some cardio issues overall in some of his fights, and so I think that, especially when you take a look at that Niko Price fight, right? So that's just another aspect that I thought of when I was taking a look at this matchup. Another thing I'll say is Rodriguez, I know he's a striker, but he has kind of shown some better or more intelligent takedown defense. I don't know how to word this properly, but if he can keep the fight standing, it plays to his strengths and kind of nullifies Morono's grappling advantage overall, because he does have he has kind of tweaked and improved on that takedown defense over time. Last thing I'll say is that Rodriguez, we've seen him carry that finishing ability in fights, and so I think that if he can kind of hurt Morono, he's not just going to keep wearing down on him, he's going to try to capitalize and get the stoppage if he's able to do that. Do I expect him to do that? No. Bottom line, I am leaning towards a Rodriguez decision here. I don't think he's going to get a finish, but I will say that he is able to. So if he catches Morono, he is going to pursue and hunt for that finish. For the next fight, we have Julia Polastri versus Cory McKenna. Let's go and review their stats here. Julia is 5 feet 2 inches tall with a reach of 63 inches, and she's 26 years old. On the other hand, we have Cory, who's 5 feet 3 inches tall with a reach of 58 inches, and she's 25 years old. So she has a 1 inch height advantage. Cory, of course. She has a reach disadvantage of 5 inches, and she is 1 year younger. So when it comes to striking, Julia lands 5.45 strikes per minute with a 52% accuracy. Now Cory, she lands 3 strikes per minute at a 40% accuracy. So less strikes, less accurate. As far as grappling goes, Julia lands 1.54 takedowns on average with a decent accuracy, while Cory, on the other hand, she has 2.22 takedowns on average with a 58% accuracy. And let's talk about defense here. Julia, she absorbs 6.32 strikes per minute with a 57% striking defense and a 42% takedown defense, whereas Cory, she absorbs 3.19 strikes per minute. So that's just about half of the strikes that Julia absorbs, which is key. She also has a 48% striking defense and a 71% takedown defense. Now let's take a look at Julia Polastri's recent fight history. Now recently, Julia is coming off of that loss against Josephine Knudsen, which was via unanimous decision back in June of this year. Her total record, 12 wins and 4 losses. Out of those 12 wins, 4 of those were KO/TKOs, 3 of those were submissions, and 5 were decision victories, which gives her a 58% finishing rate. Out of her 4 losses, all of those were decision losses. She does have 1 first-round finish, obviously not a huge part of her 12 wins. But recently she's done well overall. She's won 4 of her last 5 fights, even though recently she is coming off of that loss into this particular fight. But before then, she was doing really, really well. Now, her most recent win was back in September of 2023, late last year, and her most recent loss was back in June of this year. Now, let's take a look at Cory McKenna's recent fight history. Now, recently, Cory is coming off of that loss against Jacqueline Amorim, which was via submission back in March of this year. Her total record, 8 wins, 3 losses. Out of those 8 wins, 2 of those were KO/TKOs, 2 were submissions, and 4 were decision victories, which gives her a perfectly even 50% finishing rate. Out of her 3 losses, 1 was a submission and 2 were decision losses. She does have 2 first-round finishes, not a huge part of her 8 wins, but still notable. Recently, she's won 3 of her last 5 fights, but she is also coming off of a loss into this fight. Her most recent win was back in December of 2022, so it's still been a while, and her most recent loss was back in March of this year. Now let's take a look at what my prediction models predicted, their weighted average, and then my final pick that takes that and also incorporates other non-stat based research and fight film study observations, takes all of that into account as well. So talking about prediction models, 5 of 7 of our prediction models are leaning towards Julia Polastri, and the other 2 are leaning towards Cory McKenna. When I weigh those together, I'm getting a 58.7% probability of victory for Julia. Now, after doing research outside of just the stats and watching some of their previous fights, I think that that prediction is actually a fair one. I'm not really going to change it too much. And I will say Julia, she does have a reach advantage of 5 inches. She lands 2.45 more strikes per minute. She has a 12% higher striking accuracy and a 9% higher striking defense. She also has a 42% higher takedown accuracy and lands 0.4 more submissions on average as well. That's why I'm thinking that 59% probability of victory for Julia sounds just about right. She's won 12 fights overall. She's finished 58% of those. She has had a fight in the UFC, but she did not win that fight. Recently, regardless, she's won 4 of her last 5 fights, and I think that she will get this done. But let's talk about the intangibles and why I think she'll get it done, and maybe how I think she'll get it done. For starters, I think that Julia, she's going to try to keep this fight standing, especially if she's going in with the right game plan. She's going to utilize her striking skills where she has a clear advantage here, and keep in mind she has that longer reach. I think it's about 5 inches, and if she uses that, maintains the distance, and kind of lands strikes from outside, it would be wise. Now, I will say in terms of grappling and submissions, if Polastri can get the fight to the ground, she might have an advantage, honestly. I will say that McKenna, she was kind of submitted a little bit easily in her last fight, if I'm being honest. So again, depending on if Julia has really trained to exploit that kind of weakness, it could potentially be something out there for the taking. I'm not saying I necessarily think that's how this fight will happen, but it's just another option and another possibility, not probability, right? Continuing, I think that Polastri, she's going to try to push the pace and kind of keep McKenna backing up a little bit against the fence. We've seen kind of how women's MMA fights tend to go, and I think that this story is going to be very similar. She's going to kind of control the center of the octagon and then score points with the judges, and then eventually just have her back up against the fence, continue to score, so on and so forth. I don't necessarily think that Julia will get a finish. I'm leaning a little bit more towards a Julia decision victory, unanimous decision victory, of course. One other thing I wanted to touch base on is, if Julia does have a little bit of a better conditioning overall, she could kind of push a high pace and kind of wear McKenna down. But it was hard for me to judge who has the better cardio and endurance overall. I think this fight is a little bit even, but at least on paper, right? But I'm still leaning towards Julia. I think Julia will get it done. Again, I'm giving her just under 60% probability. I'm sticking with the model's readings in this one. For the next fight, we have Grant Dawson versus Rafa Garcia, an interesting fight. We have Grant Dawson, who's 5 feet 10 inches tall with a reach of 72 inches, and he's 30 years old. Then we have Rafa Garcia, who's 5 feet 7 inches tall. That's a 3-inch height disadvantage here. He also has a 2-inch reach disadvantage. He has a 70-inch reach, and he's the same age at 30 years old. When it comes to striking, Grant lands 2.98 strikes per minute at a 52% accuracy. Now, Rafa lands 4.19 strikes per minute, which is about 1.5 more, and then he has a 42% accuracy, so 10% less accurate, but throws much more volume overall. As far as grappling goes, Grant lands 3.61 takedowns on average with a 38% accuracy, while Rafa, on the other hand, he also lands 3.61 takedowns on average, but with a little bit better of an accuracy at 44%. Now, lastly, when it comes to defense, Grant absorbs 2.11 strikes per minute with a 45% striking defense and a 57% takedown defense, whereas Rafa, he absorbs 4.21 strikes per minute, so he absorbs 2 more strikes per minute, but he has a 61% striking defense and a 79% takedown defense. Kind of a toss-up with those stats. So let's take a look at their records to try to get a little bit more information and see if we can make a well-informed decision, or at least head that way, right? So when we take a look at Grant Dawson's recent fight history, he's coming off of that win against Joe Selecki, which was via unanimous decision earlier this year, which was back in June. His total record is 21 wins and only 2 losses. Out of his 21 wins, 4 of those were KO/TKOs, 13 of those were submissions, which is insane, and 4 were decision victories. And because of those submissions, he has an 81% finish rate, which is insane. He does have 7 first-round finishes, so this guy does go in and try to get the job done early, more times than he does. At least a third of his victories were first-round finishes. Let's break down his losses real quick. Both of those were KO/TKO losses. Now, recently he's done very well. He's won 4 of his last 5 fights, and he's coming off of a win into this fight, so he's carrying some momentum with him as well. The most recent win was back in June of 2024. Most recent loss was in October of last year in 2023. Now let's take a look at Rafa Garcia's recent fight history. Now recently, Rafa is coming off of that win against Clay Guida, which was via unanimous decision back in April of last year in 2023. Now Rafa's total record, 15 wins and only 3 losses. Out of those 15 wins, 1 of those was a knockout, 8 were submission victories, and 6 were decision victories, which gives him a 60% finish rate. Out of his 3 losses, all of those were decision losses. Now he does have 6 first-round finishes out of his 15 wins. Recently, he's also won 4 of his last 5 fights, and he's actually coming off of 2 back-to-back wins into this matchup. Now, his most recent win was back in April of 2023. He hasn't really been active after that, and his most recent loss was back in July of 2022. Now let's take a look at what my prediction models predicted for this fight, their weighted average, and then my final pick that takes that and also adds the other non-stat based research and fight film study observations into account as well. So starting with the prediction models, all 7 of them are leaning towards Grant Dawson, none are leaning towards Rafa Garcia. When I weigh those together, I'm getting a 79% probability of victory for Grant. Now after doing a ton of research outside of just the stats, taking a look at their previous fights, their pros, their cons, advantages, disadvantages, all that good stuff, training, etc., etc. I honestly think that 79% is pretty fair overall. I mean, I didn't dock it or increase it at all. And I mean, here's the thing. Statistically, Grant Dawson, he has that height advantage of 3 inches. He has that reach advantage of 2 inches. He's 10% more accurate with his strikes. He absorbs 2.1 less strikes per minute, which is key, especially throughout a fight. And he lands 1 more submission on average as well. The guy's won 21 fights, only lost twice, finished 81% of his wins, He's had 11 fights within the UFC, of which he's won 9. This guy does not get enough credit for that. Recently, he's won 4 of his last 5 fights. He's also coming off of a win, carrying a lot of momentum into this fight. But there's a ton of reasons outside of just the stats alone as to why I think this guy deserves a 79% confidence rating. So starting with this guy's superior wrestling, Dawson, he's really known for his dominant wrestling style and his grappling skills, especially if you've seen him throughout his fights previously. He not only statistically is really good with it, but when it comes to implementation, he's very solid when it comes to that. So if he does get Garcia to the mat, I think he's going to try to look for that choke or any other kind of submission hold. Honestly, the guy's very solid when it comes to submissions. So at this point, it's only a matter of time before Rafa gets to the ground and things go bad. Now, he could also maintain top control. I mean, Dawson, of course, he's shown an ability to kind of just maintain those dominant type of positions when it comes to the ground game. And not only does he maintain them, but he keeps them for very long periods. And in fact, I think one of his recent fights, he had like a crazy amount of control time. I forget which fight it was, but the dude had an absolutely insane amount of control time. And so if he kind of keeps Garcia pinned down, he could wear him out. And the dude's just very dominant. I mean, what else is there to say? Now, I will say, Garcia, he's kind of improved his striking recently overall, so Dawson has to be a little bit wise and avoid some of those prolonged striking exchanges with Rafa and just try to stick to the core game plan overall, stick to his advantages, look to close that distance, get that clinch, and take the fight to the ground and continue to execute, right? Now, another thing that I will say that I could see Dawson doing and that he does very well is pushing a very high pace. If he's able to kind of maintain that high work rate and pressure on Rafa, then he could kind of exhaust him over the course of the fight, which it's going to be a cause and effect, right? He exhausts Rafa, then he's able to continue a dominant ground game overall. Now, needless to say, Grant Dawson has a physical advantage over Rafa. He's kind of taller and he has a longer reach as well, so a small thing to keep in mind, he could control the distance a little bit better, and that will also bleed into his grappling exchanges as well. Now, one more thing that I will say is that we can't forget that Rafa is kind of coming off of a little bit of a layoff due to that injury that he faced. I think it was a knee injury, or knee surgery, I'm sorry, to be exact. So Dawson, you know, he could kind of exploit that ring rust and any kind of conditioning issues that Rafa might be bringing back. This is kind of a huge test for Rafa. I feel kind of bad for him facing a guy like Grant Dawson. But nonetheless, I think Grant Dawson will win this fight. It's going to be via decision. There's maybe a rare chance that he gets that submission. Not rare, but I would say a less likely chance that he gets that submission victory. If you are one of those guys that's looking for a good bang for your buck, or maybe something to roll the dice on, that is a little bit of an opportunity. Of course, the betting video will come out later this week. I'll touch base on that a little bit later, but just, you know, something for you guys to chew on. For the next fight, we have Brad Tavares versus Junyoung Park. Let's go and review their stats here. Brad is 6 feet 1 inch tall with a reach of 74 inches, and he's 36 years old. On the other hand, we have Junyoung Park. He's 5 feet 10 inches tall. That's a 3 inch height disadvantage, and he has a 1 inch reach disadvantage. He has a 73 inch reach, and he's 3 years younger at 33 years old. When it comes to striking, Brad lands 3.38 strikes per minute with a 43% accuracy. Now, Park, on the other hand, he lands 4.53 strikes per minute with a 50% accuracy. So that's a little bit over maybe 1.2 strikes more per minute and a 7% better striking accuracy. Now, as far as grappling goes, Brad lands 0.78 takedowns on average with a 26% accuracy, and Park, on the other hand, he lands 1.83 takedowns on average with a 50% accuracy. So Park does have a statistical advantage there. And lastly, when it comes to defense, Brad absorbs 3.15 strikes per minute with a 55% striking defense and an 81% takedown defense, whereas Park, on the other hand, absorbs 3.3 strikes per minute with a 53% striking defense and a 57% takedown defense. Now let's take a look at Brad's recent fight history. Now, recently, Brad Tavares is coming off of that loss against Gregory Rodriguez, which was via KO/TKO back in February of this year. Now, the guy's total record is 20 wins and 10 losses. Out of those 20 wins, 5 of them were KO/TKOs, 2 of them were submissions, and 13 were decision victories, which gives him a low 35% finish rate. Out of his 10 losses, 5 were KO/TKOs, 1 was a submission loss, and 4 were decision losses. He does have 5 first-round finishes out of his 20 victories, but you know, he's kind of more of a controlling type of fighter. That's his game plan overall. He has not done too well recently. He's only won 2 of his last 5 fights, and he's coming off of a loss into this fight. His most recent win was back in August of 2023. His most recent loss was February of this year. Now, on the other hand, we have Park's recent fight history. Now, Park is coming off of that loss against Andre Muniz, which was via split decision back in December of last year. Now, his total record, 17 wins and 6 losses. And of those 17 wins, 5 of those were KO/TKOs, 6 of those were submissions, and the remaining 6 were decision victories. Very even across the board there. He does have a 65% finish rate, and he does have 6 first-round finishes out of his 17 wins. So he is able to get a finish quite a few amount of the times. Not majority of the times, but still decent. Now let's break down his losses real quick. 1 of those was a KO/TKO, 2 were submission losses, and 3 were decision losses. Recently, he's had a lot more luck than his opponent here. He's won 4 of his last 5 fights, but even though he's coming off of a loss here, he still is carrying a lot of that momentum. His most recent win was back in July of 2023, most recent loss back in December of 2023. Now let's take a look at what my prediction models predicted, their weighted average, and then my final pick that takes that and also incorporates the other non-stat based research and fight film study observations as well, and it kind of considers the intangibles that stats can't pick up. So starting with the prediction models themselves, none of them are leaning towards Brad Tavares, all 7 are leaning towards Jun Young Park. When I weigh those prediction models together, I'm getting a 72% probability victory for Park. Now, when I'm looking at my final prediction, I actually knocked that down a little bit, and there's statistical reasons for that, and there's also intangible reasons for that. I'm going to review all of them right now. So starting with statistical reasons, I gave Park a less confident 67% probability victory, as due to the fact that Brad does have a height advantage here of 3 inches. He has a reach advantage of 1 inch. He absorbs 0.15 less strikes per minute. He has a 2% higher striking defense, and he has a 24% higher takedown defense. The reason I am leaning towards Park regardless is due to the fact that Park is 3 years younger. He lands 1.15 more strikes per minute. He has a 7% higher striking accuracy. He lands 1.05 more takedowns on average, and he has a 24% higher takedown accuracy. Keep in mind, Park has won 17 fights. He's finished 65% of those. He's had 10 fights within the UFC itself, and he's won 7 of those. So that's a 70% win rate within the UFC itself. Recently, he's won 4 of his last 5 fights, even though he's coming off of that loss. But now let me hit you with all of the intangibles as to why I think Park is going to win. I think there's a lot in Park's game plan overall and the way he executes his game plan that really go into his favor, and I'll talk about what I mean. So this guy has a very high striking output. He lands a lot of volume, more than Tavares, and I think that he will just be the more offensive fighter overall. That's going to have an effect on Tavares. Also, he kind of uses this aggressive style of grappling. He averages quite a few takedowns per 15 minutes. I forget the specific number, but I know that it was much higher than Brad Tavares's takedowns in that same exact time frame. So he's going to use that aggressive grappling and some of that pressure wrestling style that he likes to use. If you've seen him in previous fights, what he likes to do is kind of move forward and use his striking and then set up the takedowns. It's a very common thing when you're pretty good at that pressure wrestling style. You're going to move forward, make your opponent think that you're kind of focusing on striking, and keep your opponent's arms up, and then boom, you shoot for that takedown and try to get your opponent on the ground where you have a stronger advantage overall. I will also say he's the slightly younger fighter. I'm not gonna lean heavily into that, but keep in mind he's 3 years younger, and sometimes when you have a 36-year-old versus a 33-year-old, that's a bigger discrepancy than you might think when it comes to MMA. But again, I'm not having too heavy of an emphasis on there. I understand that age could be just a number in MMA. So let's move on. Let's talk about momentum here. Park definitely has momentum coming into this fight, while Tavares, he does not. He has lost more of his recent 5 than he's won, right? Park, on the other hand, he's won 4 of his last 5. He's not the most active fighter, but he still is doing pretty consistent recently. I also like Park's finishing ability. We touched base on that when we talked about the records. He has a little bit more of a finishing potential, especially recently. He's had quite a few submission victories in his recent streak, and which I do appreciate and I want to acknowledge. I will also say respectfully, I think Brad Tavares is kind of declining. He's not the same Brad Tavares as we previously saw, and so when you kind of pair that with Park's pace and overall activity, I think this is pretty obvious overall. Even though I gave it 67%, it's still pretty obvious overall. So I actually think that Park will take this to the judges. He's going to get the decision victory here. I don't see him getting the finish ultimately, but I do see him posing a huge challenge and threat to Brad Tavares throughout this fight. For the next fight, we have our main event, Brandon Royval versus Taira. This is going to be an absolute banger. I guarantee it's going to be an exciting fight, a very technical fight, a fun fight. And I look forward to covering this and watching it, and I look forward to, all of us experiencing it together. So let's get started here. Brandon Royval, 5 feet 9 inches tall with a reach of 68 inches. He's 32 years old. Then we have Taira, this crazy up-and-coming kid doing very, very good. You got to watch his previous fight, man. We'll get more into it a little bit later, but this kid is 5 feet 7 inches tall. He's 2 inches shorter than Brandon Royval here, but he does have a 2-inch longer reach at 70 inches, and he is 24 years old. That's an 8-year difference. So when it comes to striking, Brandon Royval, he lands 4.33 strikes per minute with a 36% accuracy. Not bad, right? Then you have Taira, who lands 3.56 strikes per minute. That's almost one less strike per minute. I mean, it's more like 0.7 or so, but the accuracy is really where the difference lies. He has a 65% accuracy. That's a 30% discrepancy. Huge. Now, as far as grappling goes, Brandon Royval lands 0.47 takedowns on average with a 60% accuracy, while Taira, on the other hand, he lands 2.35 takedowns on average with a 47% accuracy. Another pretty big discrepancy there, 2.35 takedowns on average versus 0.47. And I know that Taira is at a 13% less accuracy when it comes to those takedowns, but still, the amount of takedowns is really what you got to focus on. Now, lastly, when it comes to defense, Brandon Royval absorbs 3.42 strikes per minute with a 46% striking defense and a 40% takedown defense. Now, Taira, he absorbs way less, 1.7 strikes per minute with a 47% striking defense and a 62% takedown defense. And a lot of that has to do with his game plan overall, which we'll cover in the next section. First, we're going to talk about these guys' records. Starting with Brandon Royval's recent fight history. Now, Brandon Royval is coming off of that win against Brandon Morono, which was a split decision win back in February of this year. His total record, 16 wins and 7 losses. Out of those 16 wins, 4 of those were KO/TKOs, 9 of those were submissions, and 3 were decision victories, which does give him an 81% finish rate. Now, talking about his losses, 1 of those was a KO/TKO, 1 was a submission loss, and 5 were decision losses. He does have 10 first-round finishes out of his 16 wins, so he does like to really focus on that first round when he can. Recently, he's done well. He's won 4 of his last 5 fights, and he's coming off of a huge win here. His most recent win, again, back in February of this year. Most recent loss was in December of last year. Then we have Taira. Let's take a look at his recent fight history. Now, recently, he is coming off of a win against Alex Perez, which was via KO/TKO back in June of 2024. Now, his total record, 16 wins and no losses. The kid is undefeated at 24 years old. He's just starting. The world's his oyster. Out of his 16 wins, 5 of them were KO/TKOs, 7 were submission victories, and 4 were decision victories. He has a 75% finishing rate. Now, out of his 16 wins, 8 of them were first-round finishes. So half of his victories were within the first round itself. He's on that 16-fight win streak. He's been absolutely explosive and impressing people with every single fight. His most recent win was in June of 2024. He's been very active as well. So now let's take a look at what my prediction models predicted, their weighted average, and then my final pick that takes that and also incorporates all those other non-stat based research factors that I do, the intangibles, and also my fight film study observations when I look back at the tape of all these fighters. So starting with the prediction models, none of them are leaning towards Brandon Royval. All 7 are leaning towards Taira. When I weigh them together, I'm getting a 75% probability of victory for Taira. Now, I will keep in mind what Brandon Royval has done and his success and his advantages. So for that reason, I'm going to knock Taira's rating down just a little bit, and there's both statistical reasons for that and also non-tangibles. I'm going to cover everything, as you guys know, right now, but just speaking statistically, the final percentage, by the way, is 73% that I'm giving to Taira with all things considered. Now, first, let's talk about statistical advantages here that Brandon Royval has over Taira, which made me which was part of the reason why I knocked the score down a little bit. So Brandon Royval, keep in mind, he has a height advantage of 2 inches. He lands 0.77 more strikes per minute. He has a 13% higher takedown accuracy as well. Now, to Taira, his advantages are that he is 8 years younger. He's 24 years old. The guy he's not even stepping in his prime. He's heading towards his prime. He has a reach advantage of 2 inches. He has a 29% higher striking accuracy. He absorbs 1.72 less strikes per minute. He has a 1% higher striking defense. He lands 1.88 more takedowns on average. He has a 22% higher takedown defense as well. and he lands one more submission on average. He's won 16 fights, never been defeated, finished 75% of his 16 fights, so he doesn't just BS his way to a victory. The guy earns his victories and he finishes his opponents. He's had 6 fights in the UFC, so he has been tested within the UFC so far, and he's won all 6 of those, of course. And you know, just a lot of momentum on this kid. But let's talk about all the intangibles that I was able to gather and kind of make a case as to why I really expect Taira to win and defeat Brandon Royval. I think that the main threat that Taira has, especially against Royval, it's going to be his superior grappling first and foremost, and also his submission ability. He has a purple belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, so keep that in mind. I think that Taira, he's going to try to take the fight to the ground eventually, and inevitably in the fight, that's going to happen. He has a significant advantage there. He's very, very comfortable on the mat. And so it's actually been a huge factor in his 16 victories, right? So that's just a huge thing that's going to be a part of his game plan and that he's going to do very, very well. So kind of branching out from that, he's also really good when it comes to offensive wrestling, and his ability to kind of maneuver his opponents into very dangerous positions for them and very advantageous positions for Taira on the ground. So he's going to try to secure those takedowns against Royval and kind of control him on the mat, where Royval has shown plenty of vulnerability in the past, particularly when you take a look at those fights like the one with Alexander Pantoja, for example. That was an example there. So another thing that I wanted to mention to you guys is that he's going to try to exploit Royval's defensive weaknesses. Royval, we've seen him kind of demonstrate some difficulties when it comes to defending aggressive grapplers in his previous fights, and so I think Taira will kind of aim to really exploit that weakness by consistently pressuring Royval with those takedown attempts and those grappling exchanges. Now also what I do want to say is cardio and pace, right? Taira, he's very young, he's very athletic, and compared to the 32-year-old Royval, who is maybe a little bit just slightly past his prime or kind of in it or so, you know, whatever you want to say, you have a 24-year-old versus 32-year-old. Those 8 years are, you know, that's a huge difference there. So he's going to try to push a very high pace. We've seen him very energetic. He's very bouncy if you see him in the octagon. So in those grappling exchanges, I think he's going to end up wearing Royval down over the course of the fight. I think that that's very obvious. One other thing I want to say is Taira has pretty good striking defense, and it's still developing. He still has room to grow as a fighter. Again, I think that he's heading towards his peak. I don't think he's in his peak by any means. So he will use his grappling to kind of keep Brandon Royval a little bit hesitant on the feet, and by mixing in those takedown attempts, he's really going to be able to limit Royval's striking opportunities and just control the tempo of the fight. And oftentimes when you're able to control the tempo of a fight, you do end up getting a victory. Now, he's not someone who just ekes out a victory. He's someone who ends up with a lot of finishes. And so this will really work into Taira's favor here. I will say, respectfully, Brandon Royval, he's very skilled, he's very experienced, and he poses his own threats as a fighter, especially when you talk about like striking and those kind of scrambling type of situations. Brandon Royval does pretty good in those. However, I think Taira and his grappling skills, his submission skills, they're just going to be the pure deciding factors in this matchup. I think he uses it very, very well. I'd be surprised if he doesn't really lean in that game plan. Also, are we not going to talk about that Alex Perez fight and what Taira was able to do? The guy, so first of all, if you haven't seen that fight, or you kind of forgot, or you're like, who is Taira, who's, you know, please go watch that previous fight with him and Alex Perez. The guy ends up in a position where he has a body triangle on a standing up Alex Perez. I want you to picture that, a standing up fighter, Alex Perez, and Taira has a body triangle on him. He's hanging off his back. It's almost like Alex Perez is vertical and Taira is horizontal, just glued to the guy's back. Not only that, but the guy's like punching him while he's doing all that, and then they just fall to the canvas and he just continues to you know, pour it on him. So it was an absolutely insane performance, and what I remember, everyone was very shocked, like on Twitter, social media, YouTube, everyone was talking about that at that moment. It was a huge signature moment for Taira, and very entertaining to watch as well. I mean, that's just great MMA, very fun to watch MMA, you know. It's not just two dudes slugging it out, but it's just someone being so technical that he's able to just get the best of his opponent and absolutely dominate. So bottom line here, verdict will be to Taira via submission. Very strong chance that he gets that submission victory. I expect him to do so this weekend as well. Needless to say, I am very excited to see Taira fight. This is going to be a great card. I hope you all enjoyed all the breakdowns. Best of luck this weekend. Thank you guys so much from the bottom of my heart for checking out the content, always being so supportive. And even for those of you that aren't supportive, thank you for the criticism and the constructive feedback that you give. That allows me to continue to improve over time. I appreciate each and every one of you guys. Hope you have a blessed week. Stay safe out there and see you guys in the next one. And with that, those are all of the fights for this weekend's event. I hope you all enjoyed the analysis and that your bets hit. Thank you guys for watching. Please like and subscribe as it'll help keep me motivated in creating these videos. Running this data, analysis, prediction models, and creating charts and graphs takes hours every day and week, so your support is always appreciated. Please also check out my Patreon if you'd like to support me through there. There's a $10 a month contribution option and a premium $20 a month option, which comes with early access to all of the analysis from this video, as well as promising underdogs, favorites, prop bets, and all of the extra data analysis and stats as well. This analysis, information, and these stats will help you with your bets, and it'll help support my efforts to continue providing and expanding content for you all. So please check out that Patreon if you want to show me some love and help me out there. Thank you all once again for watching, and as always, see you guys in the next one.